Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello.
Good morning.
How's everyone doing today?
Keep it real.
Alive and breathing.
That's really all you can do. All right, well, I'm going to mute while I finish my caffeinated mints.
Sounds tasty.
It's a lot tastier than heartburn from coffee.
I gotcha. Good move. I'm a tea fan myself.
Nice. What's your favorite tea?
I have lots of faves, but right now I'm doing a lot of jasmine green tea. And overall, I think I like green tea the most. I really like sencha, like the really grassy green teas.
That's cool. I don't think I know any different kind of green tea.
Oh, nice. You should definitely.
Or what the axes are.
Yeah. I'm like so nerdy about tea and have like so many tea books, so I can discuss anytime.
Nice. Noted that Laura has a special interest in tea.
Yeah, I'm starting the SIG Kubernetes tea.
I think there would be a lot of, I think there'd be a lot of folks interested in that.
Okay, nice, good. We already have founding charter members. It's great.
Jeremy Rickard is super into tea, if you know who that is. He does a lot of release stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, he tweets about tea too a lot.
I will check that out for sure and start the movement.
Who else? There's at least one other person whose name is escaping me at the moment. But I think you'd get a lot of interest.
All right, good.
All right, I see folks starting to cycle in here.
Good morning.
Hey, Jeremy, how are you?
Not too bad. How about you?
I'm doing okay. 2021 okay this year.
Yeah. We'll see if that's better or worse.
We've got a new look, but the same taste.
Yep.
All right, why don't we get this party started? So I'm going to try to remember the little intro spiel, and here we go. It's Tuesday, January 12th, 2021, and this is Kubernetes SIG Multicluster. Laura, I think you're on the agenda first. Cluster ID. Take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, but the host disabled participant screen sharing. What does that mean?
It means I got to go click the button.
I should have tested earlier. Sorry.
That's okay. I don't want to leave that enabled by default.
Right.
But I always forget. You should be good now.
Okay. Here we go. All right. Welcome to my desktop. I want to give an update about cluster ID. This is in a similar format of last time, but new questions. The slides are also linked in the meeting agenda.
Last time, okay, I can see your going to presentation now.
Advance the slide now. Does everybody experience a new slide? Update goals?
Yeah, we want those slide-based jokes to land this time.
Thank you. Yes, last time there was an issue, so glad we could work that out. Okay, so the update I want to give for today, similar to last time, and I'm going to briefly reintroduce what I'm even talking about for people who haven't been around. There's 3 outstanding questions by my count, so I'm going to bring those up and what I think is going on there. And then hopefully we can make a call on provisional status for people who haven't been around this. We've been thinking about merging this KEP as provisional since the end of last year, and I think we're pretty close now. So just want to touch base on that again. And basically, this whole project that we're working on is to produce a KEP that describes a standard for how clusters should refer to each other when they're in the same multi-cluster environment. Basically, what names they should call each other and where those names are stored. In particular, we want to make it useful / strict enough to unblock some known use cases. There's some known stuff given the continuing implementations of multi-cluster API that we can think of that we need a cluster ID for. In particular, being able to identify clusters in a multi-cluster setup in their logs, disambiguate pods in a multi-cluster headless service, maybe with cluster-aware DNS names so that they're nice to write as humans, and to track when new clusters have joined the environment, like our teal cluster queries our orange cluster here. Okay, next slide. So this is what I think is outstanding. We've been working on the KEP for a couple weeks since last year. This is what I think we need to talk about. So the main outstanding things: should a ID Kate's IO cluster claim, so the name itself, be strictly a valid DNS label or a subdomain, is one that we listed as needed to discuss. More broadly, do we need to change anything about the goals, non-goal sections, especially since it sounds we'll soon be advertising this more broadly as into like more groups, and maybe we want to sort of set the tone more specifically, because that kind of came up in a recent comment, and then just give an update about the naming brainstorm spreadsheet. Okay, so this is the first one. So I'm going to just give what I think is going on and then ask for opinions and feelings. But basically, there's a question if this requirement for a cluster ID that it must be a valid RFC 1123 DNS label. There was some conversation of people might want to use a subdomain here, and then there's another comment that maybe that would be a breaking change, so we should talk about it sooner. I just want to confirm that the what we're talking about here is the difference of someone having an identifier that's a single label like cluster A versus some compound one like this. And then assuming that I have that right, what do we think about this potentially being breaking, and if we have use cases for it?
So that is an accurate interpretation of
Excellent.
that matches my own. I am happy, for the sake of reducing friction, to start with a label. For context, like my comments are motivated by having added like things like environment from secret keys to the API, and secret keys were initially super restrictive. They were only valid DNS labels, and people felt that was too restrictive. So that was sort of like the experience coloring my comment personally, but I'm very happy to just start with a label for the sake of reducing friction and let people tell us if they need something more. My own opinion.
+1, the main concern with moving it to a subdomain is knowing the contexts in which it will be used, right? So for comparison, we made service names and namespaces be single DNS labels so that we could build knowably valid DNS names from them. Well, mostly knowable. And that we could use them in things like search paths without having to guess how many dots were needed to be interpreted. Now, it turns out that there are some use cases that people need more dots in their service names, and we can't really give it to them, because to expand on that would be a breaking change. It would potentially destroy clients who are making assumptions about it. So if we feel that this is important, eventually, like, I'm totally happy, let's go alpha with the simplest thing possible. If we think it's important, we should do it before we go GA, preferably before we go beta, and we should call out very clearly what it's not good for, right? And like catnating proper DNS names becomes risky because you don't actually know what the length is going to be on this thing.
Right. I'd agree there that starting with a label for now seems to be make the most sense. But I think also, you know, this kind of feeds into a conversation that's come up a whole bunch around, maybe if you do want a subdomain, that's a use case for aliases. And Laura, to one of your other points, maybe we want to add that to the list of non-goals right now, because I'm sure that will keep coming up. We're not trying to solve, we recognize that there is probably a use case for aliases, and that's not necessarily something we need to solve right now.
Okay.
If it makes it easier, I'm happy to put a comment on GitHub saying I'm fine with a DNS label for now.
Sure, and I can also put a little, since it sounds like from what Tim said, we wanted to figure this out before this goes GA, then I can put another little unresolved section somewhere so we know to clean it up.
You can just put it in the GA graduation criteria.
Ooh, okay, there's a section.
But you may even want to put it in the beta graduation criteria. Ideally, we have this resolved before we declare beta.
Okay. I will put a thing there. Put in beta graduation criteria.
This is what alpha's for, after all, right?
Believe so.
Theoretically, if anybody
Theoretically.
uses alpha, that's what it's supposed to be for.
Well, we all will build stuff around this while it's in alpha, and then we will go, I really need, and then we can talk about it.
Right. Okay, cool. So that answers this question for me. Next point was, do we need to change the goals, non-goal section, especially since it sounds like we will soon be advertising this more broadly? So on the actual PR, I felt the main criticism was to move the user stories up into the goals explicitly, which we can definitely do to make sure that they're more upfront. And Paul suggested some pros for that, which I might rip. But then I also kind of want to open the floor to this question in general, and then also in particular of the non-goals, I'm wondering if we need to expand here, because this is kind of where those were hidden. And it kind of has two pieces to it. There's a non-goal, that the non-goal is to solve any problems without specific tangible use cases, though we will leave room for extension. So this is kind of like a goal in the non-goal. And I'm wondering if there's more we want to say about this and how we think that's going to overlap when we take this to people who are outside SIG Multicluster.
I personally think the way the non-goal is phrased is good.
Okay.
Yeah, I like it. I would mention aliasing, especially because as a non-goal, especially because in the first pass, over a year ago, at an attempt to introduce a cluster ID, that was a huge portion of the conversation.
And then I can move the user stories up. And then is there anything else that we feel we need to impress upon people outside of SIG Multicluster in this section or in any other overview section? Or if people have time to give it kind of another look from the perspective of, I'm from the outside reading this for the first time, then your thoughts would be appreciated. Okay, so I'm going
I wouldn't as we expand the scope of our audience, I wouldn't overthink it too much. Let's just do it and see what the feedback is. We can iterate.
Okay, sounds good. And yeah, not too many new ideas on the naming brainstorm update. There is but it's only been a week, long week too. We do have the shiny one cluster value, so exciting. But in general, it's kind of these names. Should maybe for next steps for this, I'm wondering the opinion if we're going to merge this to provisional and then share it with more people, if we want this naming survey to go out broader or keep it within us. And then when we do that, to what other groups is this going out? In particular, I'll take whatever suggestions I got from the pull request comments that the cluster API people from SIG Project Lifecycle are interested in this. But if there's someone else I'm missing, let me know.
Project lifecycle or cluster lifecycle? I don't know what project lifecycle is. That's a new term to me.
Lifecycle.
Sorry, maybe it's cluster lifecycle and I just typed it wrong.
No sweat.
I bet someone said project near you while you were typing it, or you were
Maybe.
looking at it.
I'm still learning all of the SIGs, so I could be making them up.
Yeah, I think Cluster API SIG Cluster Lifecycle is the best potential other consumer of this, and would be a strong voice if we can get them to endorse this proposal. So I do think going out to them earnestly and soon, and letting them have material impact on the design if they feel they need it is useful, and that obviously includes naming.
Okay, awesome.
And that's a good group, and I'm sure, absolutely 100% sure that the second they had such an API, they would have 10 things they want to do with it.
All right, so they are top of the list then. They're already kind of seeing us, but I'll put them on.
Do we want to do a visit to their SIG call?
Yeah, that would be cool.
Okay.
That's a good idea.
You want to find out when their SIG call is and see if we
Yes.
can get on their agenda, and let's coordinate here. Whoever from this group wants to appear over there. We don't want to overwhelm them, but let's show up with the appropriate voices and answer questions.
Cool. All right, so I will include them in the naming brainstorm as directly related to this. And then just want to take the slot. I know that I think Tim and Paul both mentioned in recent GitHub comments, like we should merge this to provisional soon. I tried to go and like resolve all the comments that were, I think, more or less done. Sorry if that was stepping on anybody's toes who wanted to resolve their own comment, but I just wanted to make it easier to read. And I think, I guess I just want to know when we want to do that, what I should do besides resolving all the comments to make that clear when it's time. And then in particular, I'm wondering if we want to open the next stage PR for where comments come from other SIGs like SIG Cluster Lifecycle, or we want to do that on this pull request.
I think we probably want to open another for that. Like, it seems like the comments that have been coming in suggest that everybody kind of thinks, at least here, that this is generally a good idea. There's probably some things that we still need to sort out. But, you know, there've been smaller changes and like moving things around, not actual big conceptual changes. You know, it's probably okay to merge provisional and then maybe start another PR to gather feedback from, you know, as we share it more broadly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
+1.
Okay, cool. Then I'll go resolve all the last tiddly bits, including related to this goals on goals section and the subdomain part, the label subdomains, cluster names part. And then I'll just maybe ping Paul for the next step.
Cool.
Cool. That's it. No other slides.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your help.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right, Chojin, I think you're next on the agenda with Work API.
Yeah, okay. Let me share my screen. Okay, yeah, so it has been a long time since the last time we talk about this design doc, and I did some updates based on the comments from different perspective. So the first thing that I did is I add a motivation part here to introduce to discuss about the current technologies to apply the resources onto the multiple clusters, and what's common patterns that we have today, and the motivation for this API. So I list some things, the existing technologies like the Kube5 V1 and V2 and GitOps, and try to find the common abstractions for these technologies, such as they all have a single source of truth that that could be Git repo across storage, could be several RPC servers, and there will be a control loop that try to fetch the resources from that source of truth and to apply the resources onto the one or multiple remote clusters. There should also be a placement way. There should also be a way to decide which clusters these resources should be applied to. And also there's in the Valerie's original blog post, there is some criteria he thinks that is important, such as how to place resources into these clusters. Need to consider about the level of redundancies, topology, and the availability of the resources. Also for the control loop to apply the resources, we also need to resolve the problem of the garbage collecting, because there's a scenario that when we do not want to deploy the resources, we need to when we do not want to deploy the resources on a certain cluster, we need to consider clean up the resources that originally has been deployed based on the source of truth. So I think we find some motivations for this, why we need this kind of APIs. The first one is like we want to have a common control loop to apply a resource from a single from a source of truth to a remote cluster, that so that the developers could be easily to use these kind of things to integrate with any kind of the source of truth and to deploy the resources onto one or multiple remote clusters. It could be easily to integrate with some placement primitive to say which workload should be placed on which clusters. It should be able to track the workloads that has been applied to the clusters, so we can do garbage collections and to track the status of the workloads. So I think that's the motivation part I've added into this doc. Some other things I have updated, like I add some diagram with working with high primitive sections to discuss about whether if we have how this work API could be work with a higher primitive. So some things like if we have a higher primitive to say I want to place a workload onto several clusters. So in the namespace full, and the higher primitive could a controller for the higher primitive could watch the higher primitive and to generate the work onto other namespace that as a container for a certain cluster, and then the work controllers on a certain cluster could get that a set of the resources in the work API and apply on the certain cluster. And another part is I have some changes on the it's on the sorry, it's here. Yeah, so I also add a section about what the resources should be considered in the work. So in this doc, I just categorize the resources into 3 types. Some the workload related resources that could be the deployments, the stateful set, the config map, or any namespace scoped customer resources. And the second type is cluster-wide configuration resources, such as API service, CRDs, or storage classes, and also the credentials. So I think the work API should only be concentrates on the workload-related resources. And for the other type of the resources, like the secrets and cluster-wide configurations, we should not use work APIs, but have other techniques to propagate to the remote clusters if we want to. So I think, yeah, I think this is something that I've updated in this doc. There are any comments or any questions?
I'm waiting to see what Tim has to say.
I made all my comments on the doc. I'm tempted to pull up the drawing that we talked about before the holidays and just map all the terms. But it was this a proposal a few weeks back that inspired me to go do that drawing in the first place. So my opinion.
Do you think?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to ask Tim. Do you think maybe this KEP would be like the PR that eventually is formed for this KEP should have that doc or should have that diagram in it? Because I think that would be a good place to put it.
Yeah, I still have on my to-do list like to put that drawing in a place that other people can actually use it. At the end of the day, what I see here is if you squint, a more or less generic implementation of that diagram. I don't remember what I called the diagram at this point. But you could roughly use this to carry anything and provide feedback, right? So it's in my eyes, it's basically GitOps with a Kubernetes API, which is not a bad thing. It's just a different design, right? And I know it's supposed to be about work and workloads, but honestly, I don't really see a whole lot that's tying it to that. And again, that's not a negative thing. It's just an observation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a valid observation.
So given that observation, does it become a question? What is the benefit of this over GitOps, other than just a reimplementation in the Kubernetes API? Is there a key benefit of doing this way?
I think to me, the clear benefit is like ability to track and to GC when you're done with your, we could call it work, we could call it something else, but whenever you're done and you want to pack up your toys and go home, this gives you GC.
I think there's another aspect here as well. The doc talks about this notion of placement and how you drive scheduling of this type of distributed work across a set of clusters. Maybe it exists, but I haven't really seen a great example where GitOps is good as a process of actually making decisions around things like placement. If I know I want to ship the same set of resources to one or a fixed set of clusters, GitOps is a really powerful model. I think the advantage of this type of approach is that I can just declare, here are the payloads that I want to be distributed, and I can decouple a little bit of where they're placed, when they're placed, how they react to failure. And that may be, I could still apply GitOps even to that first phase, right? I could have a GitOps flow that applies these work declarations into a cluster, which is then helping to distribute work across parts of the other fleet.
So perhaps I misinterpreted pretty deeply, but I thought this was not a meta scheduler. Like this wasn't making real-time decisions about which cluster to schedule a job into. It was taking that as declared. Did I misinterpret that completely?
I think this gives you a vehicle that you could drive more behavior from some of the references to that common abstraction, right? The actual work placement behavior here doesn't have any dynamicism in it, but it gives us a primitive that you could build some of that around it.
But at
Sure.
some
Yeah,
level,
guys,
wouldn't the distributed deployment from kubefed do the same thing, right? There are these constructs that say, look, here's a resource I want to deploy across multiple clusters. It's left to the implementation of the controller handling that, how it's distributed across there, whether that is prescriptive or resource-based.
But in this API, it's explicit, like take this foo and put it in the bar cluster. I suppose you could leave the binding off, right? But if we want to do that, that should be probably explicitly part of the API, and that really does tie it to workloads, as opposed to something like, I don't know, an RBAC rule, right? We wouldn't schedule an RBAC rule.
I think we're kind of crossing two streams here. I view the work thing as the transport, and I view scheduling as something that happens above that. I do not think work should have scheduling in it.
Agreed.
Agreed.
And I think the only thing I wanted to try to get across is that separate from GitOps, where GitOps typically has a pretty direct model of content from this repo goes to this cluster. This just gives a primitive that could be used to build other abstractions around it. And I think that's where it would be a little bit different. If I'm only ever shipping the same set of resources, whether they be workload centric or RBAC centric via GitOps through a fixed cluster, definitely that works for fixed clusters. Where I think this could be very useful is that as a primitive, as a building block, you could build other modes of placement or workload or other things around it, which, Tim, to the point about an RBAC rule, indicating that I want a certain kind of RBAC rule to exist on certain kinds of clusters, even though it's not workload centric, is still valuable to be able to say, go deliver this content to these clusters and give me the status feedback loop on whether they're in a healthy state or not. Have they been modified, tampered with, et cetera?
Right. So that could be driven by Git, or that could be driven by Kubernetes API, or by any other thing you can imagine. And you can still get the feedback. There are different trade-offs, right? Git has a nice history, but it's not so good with status. This is great with status, but not so good with history. So there are different use cases that different users will have their own value propositions on, which is a good thing. This is what ecosystem is, the million flowers. And then I agree completely with the idea that having a live API server that you can load things like custom resources into and build higher level abstractions, building meta scheduling on top of this, potentially interesting if meta scheduling is what somebody wants.
Mm-hmm. I also would observe they're not necessarily mutually, a GitOps flow and this style of work API, these are not mutually exclusive capabilities. I could apply GitOps down to the cluster that's represented in the diagram as blue, and then have that work controller take the next leg of distribution. So I could have my history, and I could still go to a single cluster and understand the status of what's going on in the fleet.
Sure.
So regarding multi-cluster placement, I recently had a nice experience with Admiralty IO project. So basically they are doing the placement through virtual kubelet. And this is where this dynamic scheduling works pretty nicely, and everything is pretty much controlled with annotations. So here we go, like we can utilize this GitOps style of things. So maybe guys, you can look into the project to avoid some duplication, at least in a dynamic scheduling part. It worked pretty nicely for me.
I want to be careful not to send us down a tangent. I mentioned the placement as something that could be built around the primitive, but as Tim observes, it's not a core part of this design or a requirement even to leverage the API.
Yeah, but my point is that maybe if it's not part of this API, so there is already projects that implements that, so even better, right? So we can combine both.
Agreed. And I think combining it with a placement capability is potentially powerful.
Cool.
So I think this is probably ready to start turning into a like issue an enhancements repo and a PR to get to provisional. Anybody object to that?
So I had a question on that with respect to the ultimate goals of this. Usually, at least the KEPs that I experience are proposals that are like, hey, we're making Kubernetes better by adding stuff to the core-ish of the system, or I guess core and mantle, as Brian would have said. This feels more like crust or ecosystem than core. So am I misinterpreting that? Like, is the goal? Let me back up. If somebody came in with a GitOps thing and said, hey, we want to make a KEP for a GitOps system that performs all of the same basic functionality as this, but does it through Git, would we also endorse that project?
I see what you're saying, Tim. It is not personally important to me to have a KEP just for the sake of doing so, since I think you make a good point about enhancing the core. I do think that it is a good idea to record the things that the KEP captures and to talk about graduation criteria. So I personally would be fine to put it somewhere else. But
well, I don't object. I'm not objecting to a KEP. I'm simply saying, I guess most of the KEPs that I personally have interacted with are not as ecosystem-y as this feels. So my question is really, like, we're endorsing effectively like an optional SIG-related project. Cool, like that's great. Is as long as we're okay that we open that can of worms, right?
I don't want to open any cans of worms if I can avoid
I don't know
it.
if other SIGs are doing this with ecosystem-y projects. I simply don't know.
Maybe it's something that we should take a look at and make the decision as a group. So I'm hearing an action item of like, let's see if we think this fits with the currently open KEPs as something that should receive that kind of like endorsement type treatment implied by a KEP. Sound fair, Tim?
Sure. Yeah. And again, I want to just reiterate, like, this is in no way like me trying to be negative or gatekeep or anything. I simply don't know what the done thing is right in this area.
Yeah. Okay. So Chojin, maybe you and I can take a look at like and browse through the open KEPs and see if we think this fits or if it's maybe something we want to capture with a similar process, but doesn't have to go in enhancements.
Okay.
Sound good, everybody?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Anything else to talk about?
I didn't see a link to this document in the notes in the agenda today. Can we get that just added to the agenda so we can find it quickly?
Yeah, I will post a link on the agenda.
Thanks.
Okie doke. Well, if there's nothing else, you can get the rest of your day back. And we'll see everybody next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks a
Chojin.
lot. Bye.
Thanks, Laura.
See ya.
See ya, everybody.